August 1835. Virginia heat doesn't just fall on you, it suffocates, presses down like a hand over your mouth until breathing itself becomes an act of defiance. At Dunridge Plantation, the air hung thick enough to choke on, carrying the stench of tobacco fields and something darker. Something rotting from the inside out. Samuel's body was still warm when they cut him down. 23 years old. His crime? Looking Master Nathaniel Dunridge in the eye for 3 seconds too long. The punishment? 200 lashes in the August sun while the overseer, Harlan Voss, counted each stroke with the enthusiasm of a man who loved his work. Samuel lasted until 147. His back had looked like butchered meat, bones showing white through the red. His screams had echoed across the tobacco fields until they turned to wet gurgles, then nothing at all. They'd made everyone watch. Master Garrett Dunridge's orders. He believed in lessons that lasted. That night, under a blood moon that turned the Virginia sky the color of fresh wounds, 3 men met at the old stone well behind the quarters. The well was ancient, built before the Dunridges even owned this cursed earth, stones worn smooth by generations of hands that had drawn water, drawn hope, drawn whatever small mercy this ground would offer. Tonight, they would draw something else entirely. Cyrus arrived first. 46 years old, back crosshatched with scars that told the story of 2 decades at Dunridge. He carried knowledge passed down from his grandmother, a woman brought in chains from West Africa who'd whispered secrets about water, blood, and memory before she died. Cyrus's eyes held something the masters hadn't managed to beat out: purpose. Elijah came second, moving silent despite his size. 34 years old, shoulders broad from field work, hands that could snap lumber but had only ever touched his wife with gentleness. Until Master Colton Dunridge sold her downriver 6 months ago because she'd broken a china plate. Elijah hadn't spoken unnecessarily since. His rage lived quiet now, controlled, waiting for direction like a loaded rifle. Tobias was last, 26 and whip-smart in ways that would have gotten him killed if he'd been less careful about hiding it. He'd learned to read by watching the Dunridge children's lessons through windows, memorizing letters in dirt, building a whole education in stolen moments. He understood systems, timing, cause and effect. He knew that water flows downhill, that poison spreads, and that evil men always underestimate the people they've broken. They stood around the well, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. Samuel's blood was still under their fingernails from preparing his body for burial. The night pressed close, humid and watching. "They gonna kill us all, piece by piece," Elijah finally said, voice rough from disuse. "Every day we wake up alive is just mercy they ain't gotten around to taking back yet." "Not mercy," Tobias corrected quietly. "Economics. We're worth money." Samuel stopped being worth the trouble of feeding. "That's the only mathematics they understand." Cyrus placed both palms on the well's stone edge. The rock felt cool despite the heat, ancient and patient. "My grandmother told me about water memory. Said water remembers everything it touches. Every hand that's drawn from it. Every body that's fallen into it. Every tear, every drop of blood." He looked up at them, eyes reflecting the red moon. "Said if you put enough pain in water, if you put it there with intention, with ritual, the water takes it in. Holds it. Spreads it." "You talking about poisoning the well?" Elijah said. "Not a question. I'm talking about making this whole plantation drink our suffering," Cyrus replied. "Every well on this property. The main house well where Master Garrett draws his washing water. The kitchen well where they get drinking water. The livestock well. Every source." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "Oleander root. Nightshade. Herbs my grandmother taught me. Mixed with blood, our blood, and set with the right words, the right intention." He paused. "Won't just kill their bodies. It'll poison everything they built here." Tobias's mind was already working through logistics. "There are 6 wells total on the property. Main house, kitchen, quarters, livestock, stable, and the old well by the overseer's cabin. They're in drought. Master Garrett was complaining last week that the creek's running low. They're dependent on wells like never before. How long? Elijah asked. To contaminate them all. A week if we're careful, Tobias said. To see effects. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Poison works slow. But it works certain. And us? Elijah looked between them. We drink from these wells too. Cyrus nodded slowly. There's a spring in the woods, past the eastern tobacco field. Hidden. We drink there. Tell people we trust to do the same, quiet like. But we can't save everyone. His voice hardened. Some of us gonna die so the rest have a chance. So this place dies and can't never hurt nobody again. The blood moon climbed higher, painting everything in shades of violence. Tobias spoke carefully. This ain't just killing. This is biblical. You're talking about salting the earth. Making this ground remember. This ground already remembers, Cyrus said. Every drop of our blood that's soaked into it. Everybody buried in unmarked graves past the tree line. Every child torn from their mother, every woman dragged into the main house at night, every man beaten for the crime of being human. This earth is already salted with our pain. I'm just giving it teeth. Elijah's jaw worked. He thought about his wife, about the last time he'd held her before they took her away. He thought about Samuel's back, about the casual cruelty in Nathaniel Dunridge's eyes as he'd ordered more lashes. He thought about every morning he'd woken up wishing he hadn't. I'm in, Elijah said. Whatever it costs. Tobias took longer. His mind showed him the mathematics of it, the probability of success, the certainty of consequences, the moral weight of becoming what you hate. Then he thought about Samuel's mother, who'd had to cut her own son down from the whipping post. He thought about the future if nothing changed, an endless succession of Samuels, of sold wives, of children growing up learning that pain is their birthright. They made us monsters, Tobias said quietly. Least we can be monsters that bite back. I'm in. Cyrus unwrapped the cloth bundle. Inside, dried roots, dark herbs, and a small knife with a bone handle. Blood Moon's power is strongest at its peak. We start now. We each give blood, mix it with these herbs, and I speak the words my grandmother taught me. Then we go to each well, one by one, and we pour our suffering into their water. He held out the knife. This is a covenant we can't break. Once we start, we see it through to whatever end comes. The water won't forget what we put in it. And it won't forgive. One by one, they cut their palms. The blood looked black in the red moonlight, pooling in Cyrus's cupped hands mixed with the crushed herbs. It smelled like copper and bitter earth and something older, something that had waited generations for this moment. Cyrus began speaking in a language that wasn't English, words that rolled like water over stones, like blood through veins, like chains dragging across ground. The air around them seemed to thicken, the night leaning in to listen. The mixture in his hands began to steam despite the heat, and began to glow faintly with that same red moonlight. When he finished, he walked to the well's edge. Elijah and Tobias flanked him. Together, they looked down into the darkness, down into the deep cold where water waited. For Samuel, Cyrus said. For everyone they killed, broke, or took from us. For everyone who's coming after us who might have a chance if we do this. He poured the blood mixture into the well. It fell in a thin stream, black and red, disappearing into the depths. They heard it hit water far below, a sound like a whisper, like a sigh, like the first word of a sentence that would take a month to finish speaking. The water rippled. Then it went still. Then, for just a moment, it rippled again, from below, like something had woken up down there. Like something had heard them. Like something had answered. The morning after the blood moon, the water from the quarters well tasted different. Not bad, Exactly. Just, aware. Like it was paying attention to who drank it, measuring them, remembering. The enslaved people of Dunridge noticed but said nothing. When you live under the whip, you learn that some truths are safer unspoken. They drank the water because thirst doesn't care about omens, and they watched Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias with sidelong glances that asked no questions. The three men moved through their days like they always had, bent backs in tobacco fields, calloused hands on tools, eyes downcast when the masters passed. Perfect invisibility. But at night, they became something else. Architects of ruin. Priests of a religion built on justified rage. The second night, they contaminated the livestock well. Tobias created the distraction, deliberately breaking a fence rail near the barn to draw the night watchman away. While the overseer's assistant investigated the noise, Cyrus and Elijah worked in practiced silence. This time, the mixture was different, blood from all three of them, mixed with dirt from the unmarked graves beyond the tree line where Dunridge buried slaves too broken or troublesome to waste coffin wood on. Cyrus whispered his grandmother's words, and the mixture turned thick, viscous, wrong. When it hit the livestock well's water, the sound was different. Not a splash but a gulp, like the earth swallowing something bitter and feeling it burn all the way down. By dawn, the horses were agitated. The dairy cows refused to approach their troughs. The plantation's dogs whined and paced, instincts screaming warnings their masters couldn't hear. Master Garrett Dunridge, 53 and proud as a king in his rotting empire, noticed nothing. He took his morning water from the main house well, not yet poisoned, and complained about lazy animals while his son Nathaniel kicked a whimpering hound for its cowardice. The third night, they took the kitchen well. This was the most dangerous. The kitchen house sat 30 yards from the main house, and the cook, an elderly woman named Dinah, slept in a room attached to it. But Dinah was also the mother of a girl Master Colton Dunridge had raped when she was 15. When Elijah whispered their intentions through her window, she didn't speak. She simply nodded once and closed her eyes, giving them her silence as blessing. Cyrus's mixture for the kitchen well included rust scraped from the chains in the punishment shed, the same chains that had held Samuel, and hundreds before him. He added his blood, whispered his words, and poured it into the well that fed the masters drinking water, their cooking water, their coffee and tea and soup. The water accepted it hungrily. Inside the main house, Nathaniel Dunridge woke from a nightmare he couldn't quite remember. Something about drowning. Something about hands pulling him down into red darkness. His sheets were soaked with sweat despite the heat being no worse than usual. He went to his wash basin, splashed water on his face, and for just a moment, just a flicker, the water felt thick. Felt like it was touching him back. He blinked, and the feeling passed. Just the heat playing tricks. He went back to bed and dreamed of wells that had no bottom. The fourth night was the stable well. The fifth night, the overseer's cabin. Each time, a different mixture. Each time, Cyrus's ritual growing more confident, the words coming easier, like he was remembering a language he'd always known. Each time, the water's response grew stronger, ripples that moved against the wind, reflections that didn't quite match reality, a smell like copper mixing with the Virginia clay. By the sixth day, Harlan Voss, the overseer, was drinking straight whiskey instead of water. He told himself it was the heat making him paranoid, making him see things at the corner of his vision, figures that vanished when he turned his head, shadows that moved wrong, water stains on his walls that looked like faces screaming. He'd been drinking from his cabin's well for 5 days straight. The poison was already in his blood, already whispering to his brain, already showing him previews of the judgment coming. Delilah, the house servant, found Tobias on the 6th evening. She was 38, light-skinned enough that Master Garrett assumed she was grateful for his attention, broken enough that he thought she'd never fight back. She knew different truths. She cornered Tobias near the smokehouse, where the smell of curing meat masked conversation. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly. "I know, and I ain't stopping you." Tobias's hand moved toward the knife at his belt. Easy, Delilah said. I said I ain't stopping you. I'm thanking you. Her eyes were hard as flint. Master Garrett drinks that kitchen water every morning in his coffee. 3 cups. I make sure it's fresh from the well. She smiled, and it was the saddest, most terrifying smile Tobias had ever seen. I've been praying for something like this for 20 years. You boys are the answer. You know what's coming, Tobias said. You know we all might die from this. Baby, Delilah said, touching his cheek with unexpected gentleness, I've been dead. Been dead since I was 14 years old and first understood what my life was gonna be. This? She gestured at the plantation, at the big house where Master Garrett Dunridge sat drinking poisoned coffee, at the fields soaked in suffering. This is the first time I felt alive in decades. Because this time, we're the ones doing the killing. She walked away, and Tobias watched her go, understanding that they weren't just 3 men anymore. They were a conspiracy of the damned, and the damned were ready to take everyone to hell with them. The 7th night, they returned to the main house well, the source, the heart. This would be the final contamination, the seal on everything they'd done. Cyrus had saved the strongest mixture for last, blood from all 3 men, mixed with oleander, nightshade, grave dirt, rust from chains, and one more ingredient. A piece of rope from Samuel's noose. The mixture bubbled in Cyrus's hands, steaming, almost alive. The words he spoke this time were longer, more complex, and the air around them began to smell like a thunderstorm, like blood, like justice delayed too long finally arriving. When he poured it into the main house well, the water didn't just ripple. It surged. Bubbles rose from the deep, bursting with soft sounds like whispers, like names being spoken, like chains breaking. The 3 men stood at the well's edge and felt it, something vast waking up beneath them, spreading through underground channels, connecting all the poisoned wells into a network, a web, a trap closing slowly around everyone who drunk from these waters. It's done, Cyrus said, his voice hoarse. Every well on this plantation is bound now. Connected. The poison's not just in the water no more, it is the water. And the water's got a memory longer than empires. Elijah looked toward the main house where lamplight flickered in Master Garrett's window. How long before they know? They already know, Tobias said. They just don't believe it yet. Their animals know. Their children know, having nightmares, seeing things. But they won't believe until their bodies force them to. 2 weeks, maybe less. Then it starts for real. They stood in the darkness, 3 men who'd condemned themselves along with their oppressors, and waited for their revenge to bloom. In the main house, Master Garrett Dunridge drained his evening water glass, licked his lips, and tasted something metallic. He dismissed it. In his bed, Nathaniel Dunridge dreamed of drowning in wells full of accusing eyes. In the overseer's cabin, Harlan Voss stared at his hands and saw blood that wasn't there, heard chains that weren't there, felt justice coming that he'd never believed in. The water remembered everything now. And the water was patient. And the water was ready to make them remember too. If this story of resistance and reckoning is gripping you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The horror is just beginning, and the Dunridge family has no idea what's rising from their wells. Drop a comment telling me, have you heard of other acts of resistance by enslaved people that history tried to bury? Let's keep these stories alive. Now, let's watch the poison take hold. 2 weeks after the first poisoning, Master Garrett Dunridge vomited blood onto his breakfast plate. It came suddenly and violently. One moment he was cutting into ham, complaining about tobacco prices, and the next his body convulsed and dark red spattered across white china. His wife screamed. His sons jumped back. And Delilah, standing in the corner with a fresh pot of coffee made from kitchen well water, didn't move at all. She just watched with those flat, knowing eyes. Get the doctor, Garrett gasped, wiping his mouth with a napkin that came away crimson. Get Dr. Bartram from Richmond. Something's wrong with me. Something was wrong with all of them. Colton Dunridge had woken that morning to find his skin had taken on a grayish pallor, like meat beginning to turn. His eyes, once bright blue, had yellowed at the edges. When he looked in his shaving mirror, his reflection seemed to move a half-second slower than it should, and for just a moment he swore he saw someone else looking back, a young girl with terror in her eyes. His hands shook so badly he cut himself twice trying to shave. Nathaniel hadn't slept properly in 10 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he drowned. Every dream ended the same way, pulled down into dark water while hands grabbed at him, chains wrapped around his ankles, voices he almost recognized screaming his name. He'd started drinking laudanum to sleep, but even that didn't stop the nightmares. They just made them stranger, more vivid, more real. Last night, he'd dreamed he was at the bottom of a well looking up, and Samuel's face was staring down at him, blood pouring from his mouth like a waterfall. He'd woken up choking, his lungs burning like he'd actually breathed water. Overseer Harlan Voss was worse. Far worse. He'd barricaded himself in his cabin on the 12th day, convinced that the enslaved workers were conspiring to kill him. He wasn't wrong, exactly, but his paranoia had taken on dimensions that transcended reality. He saw them everywhere, in shadows, in reflections, in the patterns of wood grain on his walls. He heard them whispering even when he was alone. The water from his basin whispered loudest of all. On the 14th morning, he burst from his cabin with a shotgun and accused 3 field workers of witchcraft. Before anyone could stop him, he fired. 2 men died instantly. The third bled out in the dirt while Voss screamed about devils and curses and poisoned wells. Master Garrett, still recovering from his morning's blood vomiting, had Voss locked in the root cellar. But the damage was done. Fear had taken root, spreading faster than the poison itself. Dr. Silas Bartram arrived from Richmond on the 16th day, a thin man with spectacles and an air of unshakable confidence in medical science. That confidence lasted approximately 4 hours. He examined Master Garrett first, noting the bloody vomit, the stomach cramping, the strange bruising that had appeared on his torso, dark marks that looked disturbingly like handprints, like someone had grabbed him from the inside. Garrett's pulse was erratic, his breathing labored, his pupils dilated despite the bright afternoon sun. Summer fever, Dr. Bartram pronounced, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. Perhaps something in the food. We'll need to examine the kitchen stores. But then he examined Colton and found the same symptoms, plus the yellowing eyes and gray skin. Then Nathaniel, who grabbed the doctor's wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "The water. There's something in the water. I see them when I drink. I see all of them." Dr. Bartram prescribed bed rest, cool compresses, and absolutely no laudanum for Nathaniel. Then he made the mistake that would seal his fate, he asked for a glass of water from the kitchen well. Delilah brought it to him personally, ice cold and clear as crystal. He drank it in 3 long gulps. By evening, Dr. Bartram was sweating despite the cooling night. By midnight, he was seeing things in the shadows of the guest room. By dawn, he was demanding to examine the wells themselves. Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias watched from the fields as Dr. Bartram organized an inspection of the main house well. The doctor lowered a lantern on a rope, peering into the depths, searching for contamination, for dead animals, for any rational explanation for the spreading sickness. The water looked clean. Crystal clear. Perfect. But when Dr. Bartram pulled up a bucket to examine it closely, he recoiled. The water smelled wrong, not rotten, but wrong. Like a battlefield, he would later write in his notes. Like blood and metal and something indefinable. Something that memory itself might smell like if memory could decay. The source must be contaminated, he declared, though he found no evidence. We must dig new wells immediately. Master Garrett, bedridden now, refused. Wells cost money. This is just fever. It'll pass. It wouldn't pass. On the 18th day, Reverend Josiah Carmichael arrived at Garrett's desperate summons. The old preacher had served Dunridge Plantation for 15 years, blessing crops and births, and carefully ignoring anything that made him uncomfortable. He was good at that, at seeing only what he wanted to see, at finding God's will in whatever served the powerful. But when he stepped onto Dunridge soil, something in him recoiled. The air felt wrong. Oppressive in a way that transcended the August heat. The plantation looked normal, tobacco fields, neat quarters, the grand main house, but underneath, beneath the surface, something had gone rotten. Master Garrett met him at the door, gaunt and trembling. "Bless the house, Reverend. Bless the wells. My sons are saying we're cursed." It's nonsense, of course, but it would ease their minds. Reverend Carmichael agreed, grateful for the simple task. He would bless the wells, collect his fee, and leave. Simple. He started with the main house well just before sunset, reading scripture, sprinkling holy water he'd brought from Richmond. The ritual was familiar, comforting. He spoke of God's protection, of sanctification, of cleansing. The well listened. And then it responded. The water began to bubble. Not boil, there was no heat, but bubble, like something beneath was exhaling. The Reverend's holy water hit the surface and turned black instantly, spreading like ink. He stepped back, voice faltering on the scripture. Then the smell hit him. That battlefield smell, but stronger now, undeniable. And underneath it, another smell. Tobacco and sweat and fear and something older than words. The water surged upwards suddenly, splashing over the well's edge, and Reverend Carmichael saw something in that water. Not his reflection. Dozens of faces, hundreds maybe, staring up at him from the depths. Faces he'd seen before, at a distance, in the fields, in the quarters. Faces of people he'd blessed into servitude, people he'd told to accept their lot as God's will, people he'd helped keep enslaved with his carefully chosen scripture. They were all there in the water, and they were all looking at him with eyes that asked one simple question: did you think God wouldn't remember? The Reverend's Bible slipped from his hands. It fell into the water still pooling around the well's base. When he bent to retrieve it, the pages had turned red, soaked through with something that wasn't water. Something thicker. Something that smelled like copper and accusation. He ran. Didn't collect his fee. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't stop running until he reached Richmond, where he locked himself in his church and refused to speak of Dunridge Plantation. When pressed, he would only say 4 words: the ground demands payment. Back at Dunridge, the 3 men stood in the darkness between the quarters and the tobacco fields, watching the main house where lamplight flickered like dying hope. "It's working," Elijah said, his voice carrying something that wasn't quite satisfaction. "They're breaking." "They're just starting to break," Cyrus corrected. "The poison's in their bodies now, in their blood, in their bones. But it ain't finished with them yet. Not nearly finished." Tobias pulled out a small piece of paper where he'd been tracking everything with careful precision. Master Garrett, advanced symptoms. Colton, moderate but accelerating. Nathaniel, psychological collapse imminent. Voss, already gone mad. Dr. Bartram, newly infected but showing rapid progression. The Reverend, he saw something. Whatever's in that water, it's showing people truth they can't handle. "My grandmother's ritual," Cyrus said softly. "It don't just poison the body. It makes the water into a mirror. Forces people to see what they done, what they are." Guess the Reverend didn't like what he saw. In the main house, Master Garrett Dunridge lay in his bed, feeling death creeping through his veins like cold water, and wondered what sin he'd committed to deserve divine punishment. It never occurred to him that justice and punishment might be the same thing. That the water he'd drunk every day for 2 weeks was full of the blood and rage of people he'd considered less than human. That his reckoning wasn't coming from God at all. It was coming from the ground. From the wells. From the place where suffering had soaked so deep it learned to swim. 3 weeks after the first poisoning, Dunridge Plantation stopped pretending to be civilized. Master Garrett could no longer leave his bed. His body had become a battlefield where the poison fought a war he couldn't win. The bruises on his torso had spread and darkened, forming patterns that looked less random each day, handprints, fingerprints, the outline of chains. His vomit came black now instead of red, thick and viscous, carrying a smell that made even Delilah flinch when she had to clean it. When he slept, which was rarely, he screamed names he claimed not to remember, names of people he'd sold, beaten, or worked to death over 30 years of ownership. Dr. Bartram had stopped pretending he could help. He'd been at Dunridge for 7 days, drinking the poisoned water, breathing the poisoned air, and now his hands trembled constantly. His medical notes had devolved from clinical observations into rambling passages about water that watched him, about reflections that showed different faces than his own, about the sound of chains dragging through the walls at night. On the 21st day, he demanded to examine the wells again. This time, he didn't just look. He had buckets drawn from every well on the plantation, lined them up in the yard, and tested each one. I looked at them. Smelled them. Even tasted them, desperate for answers. Every sample looked clean. Crystal clear. Perfect Virginia well water. But every sample smelled like a battlefield. Like copper and clay and something rotting underneath. And when Dr. Bartram stared into the buckets long enough, the water stared back. It's not natural, he told Master Garrett that evening, his voice high and thin. This isn't cholera or typhoid or any disease I've studied. The water itself is wrong. The source is wrong. This whole plantation is wrong. Then fix it, Garrett rasped from his deathbed. You're a doctor. Fix it. I can't fix a curse, Bartram whispered, and left the room shaking. Nathaniel Dunridge had descended into a waking nightmare. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in 2 weeks. The laudanum no longer worked. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes, he drowned. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw Samuel's ruined back where his face should be. Every time he drank water, even a sip, he tasted copper and heard screaming. On the 22nd night, he barricaded himself in his room with 3 lanterns burning and a pistol loaded. He'd seen them. Finally seen them clearly. The figures that walked the halls at night, dripping water that left no puddles, their feet making sounds like chains dragging. They stood outside his door, whispering his name in voices he recognized but couldn't place. Asking him questions he didn't want to answer. Why did you order the extra lashes? Why did you smile when they screamed? Did it feel good? Do you remember their names? He pressed the pistol barrel to his temple 3 times that night. 3 times, he lost the courage to pull the trigger. Living had become torture, but dying meant answering those questions forever. Colton Dunridge had stopped speaking entirely. His skin had gone from gray to nearly translucent, veins showing dark beneath like cracks in marble. His eyes had yellowed completely, the whites now the color of old parchment. He spent his days sitting at his window, staring at the main house well, watching it like it might speak to him. Sometimes, he swore it did. Sometimes, he heard a girl's voice rising from the depths, young and terrified, calling his name. Calling him father to a child he'd never acknowledged, a child born from violence he'd convinced himself didn't count as sin. The water remembered what he'd forgotten on purpose. And then Harlan Voss escaped the root cellar. They found the door smashed open from the inside on the morning of the 23rd day, wood splintered like something with inhuman strength had torn through it. Voss was gone, and so was the axe that had been stored nearby. The enslaved workers whispered that he'd been screaming all night, not words, just animal sounds of rage and terror, until suddenly he went silent. Then came the sound of breaking wood. Then nothing. They found him at noon, standing waist-deep in the livestock well. He'd killed the axe guard who came to investigate, split his skull clean open. Now he stood in the poisoned water, holding the bloody axe, laughing. Not the laughter of joy or even madness. The laughter of a man who'd finally understood the joke and realized he was the punchline. "It's in me," Voss called out when he saw them approaching. I can feel it swimming in my veins. All of them. Everyone I hurt. They're inside me now, eating me from the inside out. He splashed the water with his free hand, watching it cascade. The water's alive. Did you know that? It's full of ghosts, and the ghosts are hungry. Master Garrett, propped up by servants, tried to reason with him. Harlan, come out of there. You're sick. The fever's got your mind. Ain't fever, Voss said, grinning with too many teeth. It's justice. Can't you taste it? Every time you drink, you're drinking them. Everyone who died here. Everyone we killed. They're in the water, and now they're in us, and they're gonna hollow us out until there's nothing left but guilt and screaming. He brought the axe down on his own leg. The sound was wet and final. He toppled into the water, still laughing, and the laughter bubbled up for a few seconds before the water pulled him under. They watched him thrash once, twice, then go still. When they finally pulled his body out 3 hours later, his eyes were open and his face was locked in an expression of absolute terror. In his death grip, he held a piece of paper, his confession, waterlogged but readable, detailing every crime he'd committed at Dunridge Plantation over 12 years. Nobody knew when he'd had time to write it. Nobody wanted to ask. Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias heard about Voss's death in the fields. They didn't celebrate. The work they'd started had taken on its own momentum now, rolling downhill like a boulder, crushing everything in its path, and they weren't entirely sure they could control it anymore. It's stronger than I thought it would be, Cyrus admitted that night. My grandmother's ritual, it was supposed to poison them, make them sick, maybe kill them. But this. He gestured toward the main house where shadows moved behind curtained windows. This is something else. Something older. We didn't just poison the water. We woke something up. Can we stop it? Tobias asked. Cyrus was quiet for a long time. Don't know if I want to. Elijah looked toward the overseer's cabin, where Voss's body lay wrapped in canvas, waiting for burial nobody wanted to perform. Good, he said simply. Let it finish what we started. On the 25th day, Reverend Carmichael returned. Not because he wanted to. Because he couldn't stop himself. The visions had followed him to Richmond, faces in his wash basin, voices in his church, the smell of copper in his communion wine. Dunridge called to him like a wound calls to infection. He had to go back. Had to try one more time to cleanse it. Had to prove to himself that God's power exceeded the power of whatever evil had taken root there. He arrived at sunset, Bible clutched to his chest like armor. The plantation looked worse than when he'd left. The fields nearest the wells had started dying, plants withering despite the August growing season. The air smelled wrong, thick and wet and rotten underneath. The wells themselves seemed darker, deeper, like they'd expanded in the days since he'd fled. Master Garrett met him at the door of the main house, barely able to stand. Help us, he whispered. Please. Whatever this is, make it stop. Reverend Carmichael nodded. He'd prepared for this. He'd brought holy water blessed by a bishop, sacred oils, every prayer of exorcism he could find. He would perform the ritual at the main well. He would drive out whatever demons had poisoned this place. He would fail spectacularly. As the sun dropped below the horizon, turning the sky the color of an old bruise, Reverend Josiah Carmichael approached the main house well for the second and final time. Behind him, the Dunridge family watched from windows, Garrett supported by servants, Colton with his yellow eyes reflecting lamplight, Nathaniel with his pistol still in his belt. Around the edges of the yard, in the growing darkness, the enslaved people of Dunridge gathered silently. Watching. Waiting. In the tobacco fields, 3 men stood together, and Cyrus's grandmother's words came back to him clear as the blood moon that had started everything, water remembers. And water takes vengeance for those who can't. The Reverend began his prayer. The well began to answer. And the real horror was just beginning. The Dunridge Plantation is collapsing from the inside out, and the poisoned wells are hungry for more than just blood. If you're gripped by this tale of supernatural justice, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. What do you think will happen when the Reverend tries to bless that well? The water has been listening, and it's ready to speak back. Let's continue. Reverend Josiah Carmichael's exorcism lasted exactly 7 minutes before the well spoke back. He'd started confidently, voice booming scripture into the Virginia twilight, holy water splashing against ancient stone. The enslaved people watched from the shadows. The Dunridge family watched from their windows. And the 3 men who'd started everything watched from the tobacco fields, somehow knowing, that this was the moment everything would finish. Carmichael was halfway through the Lord's Prayer when the water began to rise. Not overflow. Rise. Against gravity, against nature, against God Himself if you believed in such things. The water climbed up the inside of the well shaft like it had hands, like it was pulling itself up using the stone as leverage. It reached the top and kept coming, spilling over the edge in thick streams that moved too slow, too deliberate to be natural. The Reverend's voice faltered. The water pooled around his feet, warm despite coming from the deep cold earth. It smelled like copper and tobacco and something underneath that made his stomach clench, the smell of old suffering, of pain that had fermented into something toxic. I command you, he tried again, voice shaking now, in the name of the Father. The water erupted. A geyser of blood-dark liquid shot 30 feet into the air, raining down on everything, the yard, the house, the Reverend himself. It was warm. It was thick. And it carried voices. Hundreds of voices. Thousands maybe. Every person who'd suffered at Dunridge, every drop of blood that had soaked into this cursed ground, every scream that had been swallowed by the Virginia heat, all of it came pouring out of that well in a column of water and memory and rage that had waited too long to be heard. The Reverend saw faces in the spray. Recognized some of them. People he'd buried. People he'd blessed into bondage. People he'd told to accept their suffering as God's will. They were all there, and they were all screaming the same question: where was God when we needed Him? Carmichael ran. Again. This time he didn't stop until he reached North Carolina. But the well wasn't finished. The eruption continued for hours, flooding the yard, seeping into the main house, spreading like an infection through every crack and crevice. The water carried something in it, not just poison now, but intention. Purpose. Hunger. Master Garrett Dunridge died that night. Finally, mercifully, terribly. Delilah found him in the morning, his body twisted in sheets soaked through with water that had seeped up through the floorboards. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and his mouth was full of mud. Mud mixed with blood. Mud that smelled like the bottom of a well. His hands were locked around his own throat, like he'd been trying to strangle himself, or like he'd been trying to pull something out that had crawled down his windpipe. On his chest, written in the mud that had killed him, were 3 words: "We remember you." Nathaniel found his father's body and something inside him finally shattered. He walked to the main house well, still overflowing, still bleeding water into the Virginia soil, and he just stood there. Staring into it. The water had calmed now, gone smooth as glass, and in that dark mirror he saw everything he'd ever done reflected back at him with perfect, horrible clarity. Every casual cruelty. Every unnecessary lash. Every time he'd smiled at someone's pain. Every time he'd broken someone because he could, because it felt good, because he'd never been taught that enslaved people were actually people, and by the time he was old enough to know better, he'd enjoyed the power too much to stop. The water showed him Samuel. Showed him the moment Samuel's back had split open like rotten fruit. Showed him his own face in that moment, not horrified, not regretful. Pleased. Satisfied. Hungry for more. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel whispered to the water. To Samuel. To everyone. I'm sorry, I'm." The water reached up and pulled him in. They heard the splash from the house. By the time servants reached the well, Nathaniel was gone. They lowered a rope, then a lantern, then finally a brave man on a harness. The well was impossibly deep now, deeper than it had been, deeper than it should be. The walls were slick with something that wasn't water or mud. Something organic. Something that pulsed. They never found Nathaniel's body. The well had swallowed him completely. Colton lasted 2 more days. His translucent skin had started to crack, weeping clear fluid that smelled like well water. He'd stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped doing anything but staring at his reflection in every surface he could find. He was looking for himself, for the person he used to be before the water showed him what he really was. On the 30th day after the first poisoning, he walked to the quarters well. The enslaved people watched him come, parting silently to let him pass. He knelt at the edge, looked down into the darkness, and saw a young girl looking back at him. The daughter he'd never acknowledged. Born from violence. Sold away before she could speak. Gone into a system that had probably killed her by now. She was standing at the bottom of the well, looking up at him. Reaching for him. Colton climbed over the edge and dropped. The sound of him hitting water echoed up from the deep. Then nothing. Then, from far below, a sound that might have been crying or might have been laughter or might have been both. The plantation's physical collapse began that same day. It started with the ground near the main house well. The earth, saturated with the blood-tainted water that had been pouring from the well for days, began to sink. Slowly at first, just a depression, just a soft spot in the yard. Then faster. The depression became a pit. The pit became a sinkhole. And the sinkhole began to spread, reaching out like fingers, following the underground channels where the poisoned water had spread. The main house tilted. Timbers creaked. Plaster cracked. Delilah and the other house servants fled, taking what they could carry, leaving the grand plantation house to its fate. By sunset, the eastern wing had collapsed entirely, dragged down into the hungry earth. By midnight, the well had become a crater 20 feet across, and the house was sliding into it like a ship going down, slow and inevitable and strangely graceful. The other wells followed the same pattern. One by one, they opened up, drinking the ground around them, pulling everything down into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The stable collapsed. The overseer's cabin sank. Even the quarters well, the first they'd poisoned, opened up into a pit that swallowed 3 cabins before people could evacuate. Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias stood at the edge of the eastern tobacco field, watching Dunridge Plantation eat itself. Around them, the people who'd lived there, who'd survived there, gathered in silent clusters, holding children, clutching belongings, staring at the destruction with expressions that mixed terror and satisfaction in ways that were hard to name. "We did this," Tobias said. Not a question. A statement of fact that needed saying. "We did," Cyrus confirmed. His face was gaunt now. The poison was in him too, not as much, not as fast, but there nonetheless. He'd been adding his blood to the wells for weeks. It had cost him. "My grandmother said the ritual would poison them. She never said it would do this." "Maybe she knew," Elijah said quietly. "Maybe she knew that some evil goes so deep the only cure is to tear out the roots. Burn the field. Salt the earth so nothing evil can grow there again." A militia unit arrived on the 32nd day, sent from Richmond to investigate reports of mass death and supernatural occurrence. Captain Thaddeus Moreland brought 20 armed men expecting to find an outbreak of fever, maybe a slave rebellion, something explainable. He found hell opening its mouth to swallow everything. The main house was gone completely, vanished into a pit that seemed to breathe, exhaling air that smelled like blood and memory. The wells had become craters connected by spreading sinkholes, creating a web of destruction that covered half the plantation. The fields were dying, the buildings collapsing, and the ground itself had become unstable, soft and treacherous, ready to betray anyone who walked on it. Moreland ordered his men to make camp at the property's edge and attempt to document what had happened. They lasted one night. The sounds from the pits, water rushing, chains rattling, voices singing songs in languages Moreland didn't recognize, drove them back to their tents. 3 men who got too close to the largest crater simply vanished, pulled down into earth that moved like water, like it was alive, like it was hungry. In the morning, Moreland found Cyrus sitting calmly at the edge of the tobacco field, too weak to stand, waiting. "What happened here?" Moreland demanded. "What did this?" Cyrus smiled, blood on his teeth from the internal bleeding that was finally catching up to him. "Justice," he said simply. "Justice that got tired of waiting for God to deliver it." "You poisoned them," Moreland said, understanding dawning. "You poisoned the wells." "We salted them," Cyrus corrected. "With our blood. With our suffering. With every piece of pain this place ever caused." The water remembered it all. And the water decided it was enough. "Where are the others? The other slaves who did this with you?" Cyrus looked toward the woods. Elijah had died yesterday, peaceful in his sleep, dreaming of his wife. Tobias had died this morning, walking into the eastern woods to find the spring where they'd been drinking clean water, wanting to see one pure thing before he passed. "They're free," Cyrus said. "Finally free." He died before sunset, sitting in the same spot, facing the ruins of Dunridge Plantation. The militia buried him in the woods, far from the poisoned ground, and carved no name on the marker. Some stories, Moreland decided, were better left untold. But the ground remembered. The water remembered. And in the deep places where the wells had been, where the plantation had collapsed into darkness, 3 voices sang in harmony, satisfied, eternal, and waiting to make sure nothing like Dunridge ever rose from that cursed earth again. The ground never healed. In the immediate aftermath, late August 1835, the Commonwealth of Virginia sent surveyors to assess the damage and determine if Dunridge Plantation could be salvaged. They returned with reports that read like fever dreams. The land was fundamentally compromised, they wrote. The well sites had become abyssal pits of indeterminate depth. The soil tested, contaminated with unknown organic compounds. The water table itself had been irreparably poisoned. What they didn't write in their official reports, what they only whispered in Richmond taverns after too much whiskey, was that the land felt wrong. Alive in a way land shouldn't be. Watching in a way that made grown men check over their shoulders. One surveyor swore he'd heard singing rising from the largest pit, 3 male voices in harmony, words in a language that sounded like water flowing over stones, like chains breaking, like suffering transformed into something that could bite back. The Commonwealth purchased the land in October 1835 for a fraction of its former value. The few surviving Dunridge relatives took the money and fled to Charleston, refusing to speak of what had happened. The enslaved people of Dunridge scattered, some to other plantations, some to freedom in the north, all carrying the story with them like a seed that would germinate in whispered conversations for generations. By November, the area was officially declared uninhabitable and permanently abandoned. But abandoned doesn't mean forgotten. The story split into 2 versions almost immediately. The white version, printed in Richmond newspapers and repeated in polite society, spoke of a natural disaster, unseasonable earthquakes, sinkhole formation, possibly caused by underground water erosion. Master Garrett Dunridge and his sons had died tragically of summer fever, the papers said. Overseer Voss had gone mad from the heat. Dr. Bartram had returned to Richmond and quietly drunk himself to death within a year, his medical license revoked after he began raving about water that remembered sins. Reverend Carmichael never spoke of Dunridge again, taking a position in a North Carolina church and burning every sermon he'd ever written about accepting one station in life. The true version, the version that mattered, lived in the quarters of plantations across Virginia, passed from mouth to ear in voices too quiet for masters to hear. It spoke of 3 men named Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias. It spoke of blood mixed with intention, of water that remembered everything, of justice that came from the ground itself when heaven remained silent. It spoke of resistance, of the price paid, and of the permanent scar those 3 men had carved into Virginia soil. Enslaved people called it the Dunridge Scar. And they made sure their children knew what it meant. 1850, 15 years later. The Richmond and Petersburg Railroad Company needed a direct route through Southside Virginia. Their engineers drew a line on the map that cut straight through what had been Dunridge Plantation. Perfect terrain, they said. Minimal elevation change. It would save 10 miles of track and thousands of dollars. Construction began in March 1850. It ended in May. The workers, mostly Irish immigrants and enslaved laborers, refused to continue after the first week. The ground, they said, was wrong. Tools broke inexplicably. Shovels struck something soft when they should have hit clay, something that pulsed like flesh. 2 workers digging near what had been the main house well reported that the dirt they removed kept refilling the hole overnight, and the dirt smelled like copper, like blood, like something rotting 15 years past due. Then the disappearances started. A foreman named Patrick O'Brien went to investigate one of the old well sites at dusk. He lowered a lantern into the pit to gauge its depth. The lantern descended 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, and kept going, the rope unreeling far past what should have been possible. When O'Brien tried to pull it back up, something pulled back. He called for help. 3 men grabbed the rope with him. They pulled. The rope went taut, then slack, then taut again, like something below was playing with them. Then the rope yanked hard, and O'Brien went over the edge. They heard him hit water far below, impossibly far below, deeper than any well had a right to be. They heard him scream once. Then they heard singing, 3 male voices, harmonizing in the darkness, welcoming him down. They never recovered his body. A second worker vanished 3 days later. Walked toward the tree line in the evening and simply didn't come back. They found his lunch pail and 1 boot at the edge of a sinkhole that hadn't been there that morning. The railroad company abandoned the route. On maps, they drew the line curving around the Dunridge property, adding 10 extra miles. Engineers never explained why in official documents. They just labeled that section of land with 2 words that appeared on Virginia rail maps for the next 50 years, unsuitable terrain. The workers had a different name for it. They called it, the Scar, and they told their children never to walk that ground, never to drink from springs nearby, never to forget that some places hold grudges that outlive empires. 1873, post-Civil War. Freedom came to Virginia in chains of a different kind, the chains of Jim Crow, of sharecropping, of new systems designed to extract the same old suffering under different names. But freedom, even compromised, still meant something. It meant the ability to remember openly. It meant the right to honor the dead without asking permission. In June 1873, a group of freed people from surrounding counties gathered at the Dunridge Scar. They came from as far as Richmond and Petersburg, some of them elderly now, some born into freedom, all connected by the story that had been passed down like holy scripture in a religion that worshipped resistance. They brought flowers. They brought food. They brought clean water in glass jars to pour at the edges of the pits that still gaped open nearly 40 years after the collapse. They sang hymns and spirituals, songs that had kept hope alive through generations of bondage. An elderly woman named Ruth, she'd been 8 years old in 1835, had lived in the Dunridge quarters, had watched the collapse from the woods, spoke the names. She spoke to them clearly, letting them ring across the scarred land, Cyrus, who carried the knowledge. Elijah, who carried the rage. Tobias, who carried the plan. The crowd repeated the names. Making sure they echoed. Making sure the ground heard. A young man placed a stone marker at the edge of the largest pit, the one that had swallowed the main house. He'd carved words into it over months of patient work. Here stood Dunridge. Here justice rose from the wells. 1835. As he set the stone in place, everyone present felt it, a response. The air changed. The ground seemed to settle, just slightly, like something beneath had been waiting for acknowledgement and had finally received it. From the deep places, they heard water rushing, chains rattling one final time, then snapping. And underneath it all, or maybe above it, three voices singing something that sounded like satisfaction. An old man named Abraham, who'd been enslaved at a neighboring plantation, spoke what everyone was thinking: they're still here. Still standing guard. Making sure what happened here is never forgotten, and never happens again. As the sun set and the ceremony ended, everyone present looked back at the scar one final time. In the twilight, three figures stood at the edge of the largest pit, silhouettes, shadows, something that might have been a memory given form. They didn't wave. They didn't move. They just stood, watching, making sure the story was told right. By the time the group reached the road, the figures were gone. But everyone knew they weren't really gone. They were just waiting. Watching. Eternal sentinels over ground that had drunk too much suffering to ever forget. 1902, The Investigators. Academic interest in the Dunridge legend peaked in the early 20th century when folklore studies became fashionable. Professor Edmund Ashcroft from the University of Virginia arrived with a team of researchers, determined to separate fact from fiction, to explain the mystery with modern scientific reasoning. They documented everything. The pits, still open, still impossibly deep. The dead zones where nothing would grow within a quarter-mile of the old well sites. The persistent reports of sounds, water rushing underground, metal striking metal, voices singing. They took soil samples, water samples from the few springs nearby, atmospheric readings. The soil samples showed impossible things. Traces of human blood in concentrations that should have degraded after 70 years but somehow remained. Organic compounds that didn't match any known classification. And stranger still, the soil seemed to register something on primitive electrical equipment the researchers brought. Faint pulses. Rhythmic. Almost like a heartbeat. Professor Ashcroft tried to interview elderly black residents who lived near the scar. They looked at him with expressions mixing pity and contempt, and refused to speak. He didn't understand. These were educated men from the university, here to preserve their history, to document their struggles. Why the silence? An old woman named Sarah finally took pity on him. You don't want the true story, she said. You want the story that makes you comfortable. The story where the masters were victims of natural disaster. Where the enslaved people were passive sufferers. Where justice didn't come from blood and rage and three men who decided they'd had enough. I want the truth, Ashcroft insisted. Sarah laughed, a sound like wind through dead trees. The truth is written in that ground. The truth is in water that remembers. The truth is that Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias poisoned the Dunridge wells with their own blood and brought that whole evil empire down into the earth where it belonged. That's the truth. But you'll never publish it. You'll write it up as folklore, and mass hysteria, and fascinating regional mythology, because the real truth means admitting that enslaved people fought back, won, and left a permanent mark that your science can measure but can't explain. Ashcroft did exactly as Sarah predicted. His paper, published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1903, classified the Dunridge collapse as an amalgamation of natural disaster and folkloric embellishment, reflecting the psychological needs of an oppressed population to imagine agency in their historical powerlessness. Sarah lived another 12 years. Before she died, she made sure her grandchildren knew the real story. Made them memorize the names, Cyrus, Elijah, Tobias. Made them promise to pass it on. The truth would survive in the places that mattered, in the memories of people who understood that resistance wasn't mythology. It was history. It was scripture. It was proof that the oppressed could strike back and leave scars that never healed. Professor Ashcroft, incidentally, died in 1905 after drinking from a spring near the Dunridge scar during a follow-up research trip. The water had tasted fine, he told his assistants. Just a bit metallic. Within 3 months, he developed an inexplicable wasting illness that no doctor could diagnose. He spent his final days raving about faces in his water glass, about voices singing in languages he didn't know, about 3 figures standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with eyes that held perfect, patient judgment. The university listed his cause of death as unknown systemic failure. But his research assistants knew better. They'd seen what happened to people who disrespected the scar, who tried to explain away its power, who refused to believe that blood and rage and intention could permanently alter the fabric of the world. The ground remembered. The water remembered. And neither forgave easily. The present day, the permanent scar. The land remains unchanged. Officially designated as protected wetlands and owned by the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Dunridge scar sits quiet and waiting in Southside Virginia. No development has ever succeeded there. No crops will grow. The pits remain open, though they've been fenced and marked with warning signs that people largely ignore at their peril. Modern paranormal investigators have documented phenomena that defies rational explanation. Audio recordings pick up sounds of water rushing underground when geological surveys show no aquifers. Digital thermometers register cold spots centered on the old well sites. Cameras malfunction. Compasses spin. And on certain nights, particularly during blood moons in August, witnesses report seeing 3 figures standing at the pit edges, watching, waiting, guarding. Water samples taken from nearby springs continue to show trace elements of human hemoglobin. Not enough to be dangerous. Just enough to remind anyone paying attention that blood, once given with intention, doesn't simply wash away. It becomes part of the land. Part of the memory. Part of the permanent record that no amount of time can erase. Local legends warn against approaching the scar after dark. Against drinking from any spring within a mile of the old plantation. Against walking the ground alone. The warnings are usually dismissed as superstition until someone ignores them. Then the warnings make sense. The 3 men are still there. Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias, their bodies long since returned to earth, their spirits bound by choice to the place where they struck their final, permanent blow against the evil that had consumed them. They are not ghosts seeking peace. They are guardians standing eternal watch. They are memory given form. They are proof that some victories are so complete they echo forever. On humid Virginia nights, near the Dunridge scar, the air still smells like tobacco fields and copper. The ground still feels wrong, watching, waiting, ready to open up and swallow anything that tries to rebuild what those 3 men tore down. And if you listen carefully, if you stand at the edge of those bottomless pits and really listen, you can hear it, water rushing underground, chains breaking, and 3 voices singing in perfect harmony. They're not singing hymns. They're not singing spirituals. They're singing the names of everyone who died at Dunridge. Every enslaved person who suffered there. Every life that was counted as property, every death that went unmarked, every piece of humanity that the system tried to erase. The song never ends. It just keeps going, fed by the blood that still runs through the underground channels, kept alive by the rage that soaked into the earth and learned to swim, sustained by the memory of 3 men who decided that if they couldn't have freedom, they could at least have revenge. And they got it. Complete. Total. Permanent. The Dunridge family is gone, not just dead, but erased. Their plantation is gone, swallowed into the earth. Their legacy is gone, reduced to a cautionary tale about the price of cruelty. The only names anyone remembers from that place are Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias, the 3 men who salted their master's wells with their own blood and brought judgment from the ground itself when heaven remained silent. Some places remember evil too clearly to ever forget. Some ground holds grudges that outlast empires. Some water refuses to run clean until justice has been served in full. The Dunridge scar is all of these things. It's not a tragedy. It's not a horror story. It's not even really a ghost story. It's a victory. Permanent and terrible and beautiful and complete. The water remembers. The ground remembers. And 3 voices sing forever in the darkness, making sure that everyone else remembers too. They called it the Dunridge Collapse. But it wasn't a collapse at all. It was a reckoning. We're approaching the end of this tale of blood, water, and justice. If this story has gripped you, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this, stories of resistance that history tried to bury, need to be told and retold until everyone understands that the oppressed have always fought back. Comment below, do you believe places can hold memory? Can suffering soak into the ground deep enough that it never washes away? Let's discuss. Now, for the final chapter. And there it is, the complete story of the Dunridge Collapse, the three men who poisoned their master's wells with their own blood, and the permanent scar they left on Virginia soil. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about resistance and justice, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I bring you these forgotten histories, these buried stories of people who fought back when the world said they couldn't. Drop a comment telling me, what act of historical resistance do you want to hear about next? What story has been hidden too long? And remember, the ground remembers. The water remembers. And now, you remember too. Share this video. Tell this story. Keep the names alive, Cyrus, Elijah, and Tobias. Three men who proved that even in the darkest circumstances, even with nothing left to lose, resistance is possible. Victory is possible. And some scars never heal because they were never meant to. Until next time, remember that history is written in blood and water, and both have longer memories than empires.